places where that future came ashore. Try to picture the town around the harbour. Not as a postcard. Not as a holiday scene. But as a town suddenly carrying the weight of history. People would have known something serious was happening. You could not hide an arrival on that scale. The movement of vessels. The movement of troops. The urgency in the streets. The sound of engines. The sight of exhausted men. The need for food, clothing, care, and direction. A harbour town understands arrival. But this was different. These were not holidaymakers. Not fishermen returning from a normal working day. Not passengers stepping ashore from a routine crossing. These were men coming back from disaster. And the town responded. Local people helped provide food. They helped with clothing. They helped with practical support. That matters. Because history is not only made in command rooms. It is also made in kitchens. In church halls. On quaysides. At railway stations. In the hands of people passing a blanket, a drink, a coat, or a word of comfort. In a national emergency, kindness becomes part of the operation. Ramsgate's role was practical. But it was also human. The harbour gave access. The town gave reception. If you are watching the harbour now, you may see only quiet water. But beneath that quiet is memory. A memory of movement. A memory of return. A memory of men stepping from boats into a country that had not yet won the war, but had not lost its army. There must have been moments of strange contrast. A man who had just left Dunkirk standing near the same harbour walls where, in peacetime, visitors might stroll. A soldier who had slept in ditches or on roads now being handed food by someone from the town. A young man who had expected capture suddenly hearing English voices around him. Imagine the emotional force of that. Not celebration. Not yet. More like disbelief. Relief mixed with exhaustion. Survival mixed with grief. Because many did not come back. And those who did return often carried the weight of those who had not. The story of Ramsgate in Operation Dynamo is therefore not only about numbers. Though the numbers matter. 42,000 men landed here. 80,000 in the Isle of Thanet. 338,226 Allied servicemen evacuated in total. But numbers are only the frame. The true picture is human. A man helped ashore. A sailor still alert after too little sleep. A volunteer handing out clothing. A harbour worker keeping movement flowing. A wounded soldier being moved away from the quay. A train waiting to take men onward. A town absorbing the shock of war arriving directly at its edge. If you're just joining us, this is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. You are listening to part 4 of our little ship's story. We are remembering not only the crossing from Dunkirk, but the arrival home through harbours like this one. The journey did not end at the water's edge. After landing, men had to be moved inland. They needed rest. They needed medical attention. They needed reorganization. They needed to be counted, directed, and sent onward. The evacuation was not tidy. It could not be. It was too large. Too urgent. Too improvised. But it worked. Not perfectly. Not without loss. But enough to change the course of what followed. And that is why Ramsgate's reception matters. Because a rescue does not only need boats. It needs places to land. It needs people ready to receive. It needs systems that can absorb shock. It needs towns that can become temporary gateways between war and home. Ramsgate became one of those gateways. Look again at the harbour. The boats today may sit quietly. The gulls may call. The tide may move gently against the wall. But in 1940 this same harbour carried a different sound. Engines. Footsteps. Orders. Coughing. Metal. Water. Voices. Maybe silence too. The silence of men too tired to speak. That silence is part of the story. Not every moment of history is loud. Some of it is quiet. A man sitting with a blanket around his shoulders. A cup held in both hands. A stare across the water. A thought he cannot finish. That is why the harbour matters. Because places hold what people cannot always say. In May 2026, when the little ships return to Ramsgate, visitors will see the vessels. They will see the flags. They will see the displays. They may hear music around the harbour. They may see families walking where exhausted men once came ashore. That contrast is not wrong. It is part of remembrance. Life continues. Harbours return to peace. Children walk where soldiers once landed. People take photographs where history once moved too quickly to be understood. But remembrance asks us to see both layers at once, the Ramsgate of today and the Ramsgate of 1940. The harbour view and the human arrival. The festival and the cost behind it. That is why this story belongs on Royal Harbour Live. Because the camera does not only show the present, it gives us a place to think about the past. If you are watching from another part of Britain, or from another country, this harbour is not just scenery. It is a witness. It witnessed vessels leaving. It witnessed men returning. It witnessed the town responding. It witnessed exhaustion, fear, relief, and survival. And when the little ships come home again in May 2026, they will return to a harbour that remembers. There is something deeply fitting about that. The vessels return not to a random marina. Not to a neutral backdrop. But to Ramsgate. A harbour that played its part. A harbour that received thousands. A harbour where the story came ashore. As Operation Dynamo continued, more men would be rescued. More ships would cross. More families would wait for news. More exhausted soldiers would pass through ports along the south coast. Ramsgate was one part of that wider effort. But it was a real part. A vital part. And for thousands of men, it was the first place where rescue became real. The moment a man stepped ashore, he was no longer only escaping. He had arrived. That arrival deserves to be remembered. Not just the departure from Dunkirk. Not just the crossing. Not just the boats. But the coming home. Because coming home is where survival becomes visible. If you're just joining us, you are watching Ramsgate Royal Harbour. This is Royal Harbour Live. And this is part 4 of our little ship's story. We have followed the harbour's past. The beginning of Operation Dynamo. The little ships themselves. And now, the return of men through Ramsgate. Part 4 is about the human landing. The moment when the sea journey ended, and the next chapter began. For some, that next chapter meant rest. For others, hospital. For many, reorganization and return to duty. For the country, it meant something larger. Britain had been shaken. But it had not lost its army. That fact changed everything. The evacuation did not end the danger. But it preserved the possibility of continuing the fight. And in that possibility, Ramsgate had a place. The harbour helped. The town helped. The people helped. And thousands came home through this water. When you look at the harbour now, let that stay with you. Not as a slogan. Not as exaggeration. But as memory. This was a place where rescue became arrival. You have been listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this has been part 4 of our little ship's story. Stay with us. Because next, we look at the legacy of Dunkirk, Ramsgate, and the little ships returning home in 2026. You are listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this is part 5 of our little ship's story. Memory returning home. By June 1940, Operation Dynamo was over. Against expectations, 338,226 Allied servicemen had been evacuated from Dunkirk. The beaches had emptied. The crossings had slowed. The boats had returned. And across the south coast of England, the harbours that had carried the operation began to fall quiet again. But history does not leave places so easily. Long after the noise fades, places remember. And Ramsgate remembers. Look at the harbour now. The calm water. The stone walls. The boats resting against their moorings. Visitors walking the quayside. Gulls turning in the wind above the marina. At first glance, it can seem peaceful. Almost timeless. But history sits here quietly. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Quietly. Because this harbour once stood inside one of the great emergencies of the Second World War. For a few extraordinary days in 1940, Ramsgate became part of something much larger than itself. A working harbour on the Kent coast became one of the vital lifelines in the evacuation from Dunkirk. Men left from here. Men returned through here. Small boats worked from here. And 42,000 servicemen came ashore here during Operation Dynamo. That fact remains part of the harbour, whether spoken or not. If you are just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live. You are looking out across Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And you are listening to the final chapter of our little ship's story. A story not only about war, but about memory. One of the remarkable things about Dunkirk is the way it survived in public memory. Not simply as a military operation, but as a national story. A story repeated across generations. Retold in books, films, conversations, school lessons, family memories. And harbour towns like Ramsgate became part of that memory too. But memory can sometimes smooth away complexity. It can turn difficult events into neat symbols. That is why remembering carefully matters. The evacuation was not simple. It was not tidy. It was not guaranteed to succeed. The men waiting on the beaches were in real danger. Ships were attacked. Boats were lost. The larger naval and merchant vessels carried much of the burden. The East Mole became essential. And the little ships became part of a much wider effort involving sailors, soldiers, harbour workers, volunteers, civilians, planners, engineers, and receiving towns. That fuller truth does not weaken the story. It strengthens it. Because it reminds us that survival often depends on many different people doing necessary work at the same time, and Ramsgate was one of the places where that work became visible. The harbour did not become famous because it sought attention. It became important because geography, engineering, seamanship, and circumstance placed it inside history at exactly the moment it was needed. That is often how history works. Not through destiny. Through readiness. A harbour built over generations suddenly becoming essential. Ordinary vessels suddenly becoming extraordinary. Ordinary people suddenly carrying historic responsibility. That is one reason the little ships still matter. They represent the moment when everyday life was pulled into national survival. Pleasure craft. Fishing boats. Motor launches. Workboats. Vessels built for ordinary purposes suddenly crossing towards danger because the moment demanded it. And the harbours that supported them became part of that same transformation. Ramsgate was not merely watching the story of Dunkirk. It was participating in it. That matters. Especially now. Because time changes the texture of memory. The men who fought in the Second World War are passing from living memory into historical memory. The people who witnessed Dunkirk directly are fewer each year. Which means places like Ramsgate become even more important. The harbour becomes an archive. Not of paper, but of presence. The walls remain. The water remains. The shape of the harbour remains. And through those things, memory survives physically. That is why remembrance matters in places like this. Because memory attached to real geography feels different. More grounded. More human. This is not an invented setting. Not a reconstruction. Not a film set. This is the real harbour. The same harbour that helped receive exhausted servicemen in 1940. The same harbour that prepared small craft for the crossing. The same harbour where people waited, worked, worried, and responded. If you are watching from another country, this harbour may simply look beautiful. And it is beautiful. But beauty is not the whole story. Places can carry beauty and burden together. That is true of Ramsgate. And perhaps that is why the harbour feels different once you know what happened here. The water stops looking empty. The silence stops feeling simple. The view acquires another layer. Memory changes landscape. If you are local to Ramsgate, this is part of your town's inheritance. Not ownership. Inheritance. A reminder that ordinary towns can find themselves connected to extraordinary moments. And that history is not only made in capitals, headquarters, and famous buildings. Sometimes it happens on quaysides. At harbour walls. At railway stations. Inside working communities by the sea. That is part of what Dunkirk revealed. Not only military endurance, but civilian involvement. Practical courage. Improvisation. Collective effort. The little ships became symbols partly because they represented ordinary life entering history. And people recognized themselves in that. A small boat. A harbour worker. A volunteer. A mechanic. A sailor. A town helping where it could. That is a very human kind of history. If you're just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live in Ramsgate. You are listening to the final part of our little ship's story. We are reflecting not only on what happened in 1940, but on why it still matters now. In May 2026, the little ships are expected to return to Ramsgate once again. More than 25 vessels are expected across the commemorative period. Some are due to arrive from the 15th of May. The main public commemorations are planned across the 22nd to the 25th. Selected ships are expected to open for public visits. And along the harbour, 338 silhouettes will stand in remembrance of the men brought home during Operation Dynamo. That return matters. Not because old boats are automatically important, but because memory needs physical connection. A photograph can inform. A book can explain. A documentary can teach. But standing beside a real vessel changes something. You realize the scale. The size of the hull. The narrowness of the deck. The exposure to sea and weather. The reality of crossing open water in wartime conditions. The boats stop being symbols and become real again. That is one reason commemorations matter. Not to glorify war, but to reconnect memory to reality. To remind people that history happened to real human beings in real places. And Ramsgate is one of those places. The return of the little ships is therefore more than a maritime gathering. More than a festival. More than a tourist event. It is a form of remembrance carried by water. The vessels return across the channel not simply as surviving craft, but as witnesses. Wood remembering. Steel remembering. Engines remembering. Harbours remembering. And perhaps people remember through them. Look at the harbour tonight. Or this morning. Or whenever you are watching. The light may be changing across the water. The tide may be moving slowly against the walls. The boats may rock gently in the marina. It can feel very far from war. And that is good. Harbours should know peace. But peace becomes more meaningful when we understand what came before it. That is one of the deepest lessons of Dunkirk. Not triumph. Not glory. But endurance. Survival. Continuation. Britain did not win the war at Dunkirk, but it survived the moment when defeat seemed dangerously close. And survival created the possibility of everything that followed. That possibility crossed this water too. Through Ramsgate. Through Dover. Through the small boats. Through the larger ships. Through the East Mole. Through exhaustion, uncertainty, and determination. The story belongs to all of them together. That is why accuracy matters. Because truth honors people properly. Exaggeration can make history louder. But honesty makes it stronger. And the true story of Ramsgate is already powerful enough. A harbour shaped over centuries. A harbour built for refuge. A harbour drawn repeatedly into national events. A harbour that became one of the lifelines in Operation Dynamo. A harbour that received thousands of returning servicemen. And a harbour that still remembers. That is enough. More than enough. If you are watching Royal Harbour live from somewhere else in the world, you are now connected to that memory too. The camera does more than show scenery. It creates witness. It lets people across the world look into a harbour with a living historical memory. That is something rare. Most places lose their stories beneath modern life. But sometimes a place keeps both. The present and the past together. Ramsgate is one of those places. As our little ship's story comes to its close, remember this. The boats mattered. The crossings mattered. The rescue mattered. But so did the harbours. So did the towns. So did the people waiting to receive those who came home. History is rarely carried by heroes alone. Usually it moves through networks of ordinary people doing necessary things under extraordinary pressure. That was true in 1940. And perhaps it is still true now. The little ships return in May 2026 not only to remember the evacuation itself, but to remember the communities connected to it. The harbours. The coast. The crews. The civilians. The returning servicemen. And the fragile line between danger and safety crossed over this water. That line once reached Ramsgate. And because it reached Ramsgate, Ramsgate became part of the story forever. You have been listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this has been our little ship's story. From the making of the harbour, to Operation Dynamo, to the little ships, to the men returning home, and finally, to memory itself. Thank you for listening. And when you look across the harbour now, remember what this water once carried. You're listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this is the story of the little ships. In May 2026, this view will change. More than 25 Dunkirk little ships are due to gather here. Some are expected in from Friday the 15th of May. The main commemorative program runs from Friday the 22nd to Monday the 25th. Selected vessels will be open for timed visits across the weekend. And along the quayside, 338 life-sized silhouettes will stand in remembrance of the men brought away in 1940. But before that weekend arrives, this is where the story begins. Not with the crossing. Not with the beaches. Not even with the order to evacuate. It begins with this harbour. At first glance, a harbour can seem like scenery. Stone. Water. Boats. Railings. Sky. But a harbour is never only scenery. It is a decision made in masonry. It is an answer to wind, tide, danger and distance. It tells you what a town had to survive. What it traded with. What it feared. And what it hoped for. And that is the first thing to understand about Ramsgate. The harbour you are looking at now was not simply built for pleasure. Long before the modern marina, long before the cafes and the walkers and the holiday photographs, this was a place shaped by the sea's bad temper and by England's need for refuge. Ramsgate began as a much smaller place than the town we know today. For centuries it was a coastal settlement shaped by fishing, farming and sea trade. The sea was not a backdrop to life. It was the road, the workplace, and the risk. The decisive change came in winter. On the 16th of December, 1748, a violent storm struck the Downs. Ships tried to escape. Ships needed shelter. And Ramsgate provided it. Lives were saved. And after that storm, something changed. The idea of a proper harbour of refuge here began to take hold. Not a small harbour. A serious one. A place where ships in danger could get under protection. Work began in 1749. But this was not quick. It was not simple. It became a long, stubborn, complicated engineering effort that lasted decades. Because building a safe harbour here was not easy. The sea fought back. Silt clogged the basin. Water movement had to be understood, not just resisted. And this is where one of the great names in British engineering enters the story. John Smeaton. His solution was simple. And brilliant. Use the sea itself. Let the harbour fill at high tide. Then release the water to scour the basin clean. So this harbour is not just walls holding water back. It is a system. A machine. Built from tide and stone. That matters more than it seems. Because in 1940, this harbour would once again depend on movement. On flow. On getting people in. And out. Quickly. By the late 18th century, Ramsgate had already become something much bigger than a local harbour. It had been tested. Improved. Strengthened. Because this stretch of coast demanded a refuge. And long before Operation Dynamo, Ramsgate had already learned how to matter. If you're just joining us, this is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And you're listening to the story of the little ships. The civilian vessels that helped rescue over 338,000 Allied servicemen in 1940. War would come back to this harbour. In the First World War, Ramsgate became a base for naval patrols and minesweepers. By the time the Second World War began, it was already a known strategic harbour. Not a backup. Not an afterthought. A working asset. At the start of the Second World War, the harbour was closed. It became part of Britain's defensive system. Mines. Patrol boats. Control operations. This was no longer a peaceful harbour. It was preparing for war. And then came May 1940. Germany's advance was fast. Relentless. Unexpected. Allied forces were cut off. Ports fell one by one. Boulogne. Calais. Gone. Leaving Dunkirk as the last escape point. This was the moment everything changed. Operation Dynamo began. Not as a perfect plan, but as an emergency response to disaster. The beaches at Dunkirk were shallow. Large ships could not get close. Men were stranded. Exposed. Waiting. And this is where the small boats became essential. The little ships. Fishing boats. Pleasure craft. Civilian vessels. They could reach where larger ships could not. But the truth matters here. The rescue was not just the little ships. Large naval vessels carried the majority. The East Mole became a lifeline. Everything worked together. Navy. Merchant ships. Small boats. Air cover. And receiving harbours like Ramsgate. And this is where Ramsgate's role becomes clear. Not the biggest ships. Not the most famous ships. But the right ships. And the organisation to support them. 42,000 men were landed at Ramsgate. 42,000 men arriving exhausted, wet, cold, disoriented. And the town responding. With food. With clothing. With help. With humanity. Ramsgate was not just infrastructure. It became a place of reception. A place of return. And at the beginning of Operation Dynamo, no one knew how it would end. Churchill feared perhaps only tens of thousands might be saved. The first day rescued only around 8,000. It did not look like success. It looked uncertain. Fragile. At risk of failure. But history had other plans. Look at the harbour now. Calm. Quiet. Almost still. But once you know this story, you see it differently. These walls. These piers. These waters. They were ready. Not by chance. But because they had been built, tested, and used for generations. If you're just joining us, this is Royal Harbour Live. And you are listening to the story of the little ships. You have been listening to part 1. When the little ships return here in May 2026, you are not just watching boats. You are watching history return to the harbour that helped bring them home. The boats are expected from the 15th of May. The main commemorative days run from the 22nd to the 25th. And the 338 silhouettes will stand here through to the 28th of June. Stay with Royal Harbour Live. Because up next, the story continues. Operation Dynamo begins. You are listening to Royal Harbour Live. This is Ramsgate Royal Harbour. And this is part 2 of our little ship's story. Operation Dynamo begins. By the end of May 1940, the situation in France had become desperate. The British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian troops, had been forced back towards the coast. The roads were crowded. Communications were strained. Ports were falling. And the army was running out of space. Dunkirk became the last major route out. Not because it was safe. Not because it was ideal. But because it was still possible. Across the Channel, at Dover, planning had already begun. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay and his team understood that if the army was to be saved, it would have to be brought home by sea. The operation was given a code name. Operation Dynamo. It was not a perfect plan. It could not be. There was no time for perfection. It was an emergency answer to a collapsing battlefield. On the 26th of May, 1940, the order was given. The evacuation began. At first, expectations were low. Very low. There were fears that only tens of thousands might be brought home. Perhaps 20,000. Perhaps 30,000. Possibly 45,000 if everything went better than expected. Nobody knew that the final number would become 338,226 Allied servicemen. Nobody standing in Ramsgate, looking out across this water, could have known that. Nobody at Dover could have known it. Nobody waiting on the beaches at Dunkirk could have known it. At the beginning, there was only urgency. And uncertainty. The first day was slow. Around 8,000 men were brought off. That may sound like a large number now. But against the scale of the army waiting on the coast, it was frighteningly small. The beaches were exposed. The harbour at Dunkirk had been damaged. The skies were dangerous. And the sea itself created a problem. Large ships could not simply come close to the beach and collect men. The water was too shallow. At low tide, the distance was even worse. Men had to wait. They had to form lines. They had to wade out. They had to climb aboard whatever could reach them. This is where the small boats became essential. Not because they could do everything. They could not. But because they could do something the larger ships could not do. They could get closer. They could move between beach and larger vessel. They could ferry men through shallow water. They could create a link. A fragile link, but a vital one. And that is where Ramsgate comes into the story again. Because Ramsgate's role was not simply to watch events unfold across the channel. Ramsgate became part of the machinery of rescue. Nearly 2,000 officers and men were brought into Ramsgate from other ports. The harbour was prepared for the small boat work that Operation Dynamo demanded. Heavier craft operated from other ports too. Dover, Folkestone, Margate. But Ramsgate had a special part in the small boat side of the evacuation. That distinction matters. Because history is